Hello again, online scholars. So, I am trying to give you the lecture on the Perren article we read for this week, but it seems like we were having a little bit of internet difficulty there. So, here we go. Let's see if it works this time. All right. So, welcome back. And for this lecture, we're going to be talking about Elisa Perren's A Big Fat Indie Success Story, question mark, article, which focuses again on industry and production in popular culture and the making of cultural artifacts. I'm having trouble talking today. I'm sorry. Just as sort of a thought experiment, I'll ask you right off the bat: is there any kind of knowledge or understanding that is not reached via narrative? In other words, is there any kind of knowledge or understanding uh, that that we can come to without a story, or at least that we could share, let's say, without a story? I think the answer to this question is no. I think at base, we are storytelling creatures. And of course, we tell all kinds of stories, and there are even stories that we don't realize are stories. So, for example, 2 plus 2 is 4 is a story, right? It has a beginning, it has a middle, right? And it has an end. It has a traditional three-act structure, the same sort of structure that was contemplated by the ancient Greeks, right? Physics is a story. The Bible is a story, right? I mean, stories are accounts where we tell other people about what we find to be important. And in stressing this hierarchy of importance, we convey knowledge to others, right? And so what Perrin has done here is she's given us her own narrative about one of the stories that's been told by Hollywood. And it relates to independent film and many of our ideas about what independent film is. Uh, and so to get started, I'll give you a little background on Elisa Perren. She used to be a professor at Georgia State. I had her for classes, and she's a lovely human being. She is a very smart person, and she now teaches at the University of Texas at Austin. So she begins her article here with a discussion that centers around the idea of media narratives, right? And the stories that the media shares with us. And in doing so, she raises a number of questions about these narratives. What do we do? How are we supposed to deal with what are partial accounts, stories that are not fully told, stories that are inaccurate or that make misrepresentations, or stories that simply represent or reinforce kinds of mythologies? Legends, for lack of a better term, and do so, let's say, dishonestly, or in a way that's not entirely accurate, right? I mean, if stories are, as I suggested to you before, about hierarchies of importance and the way that we share, knowledge with one another, then clearly when we're confronted with things like partial accounts, inaccuracies, misrepresentations, or simply the myth making for financial sake, then we could argue that there are perhaps ethical issues at play here. Um, in any event, Perrin makes the case that all these things happen in the case of one particular film, and that is My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which was an indie darling several decades ago, right? It was a very popular film that came out that had the whole independent movie mystique around it. And this independent movie mystique was established arguably by a film called Sex, Lies, and Videotape, that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival many decades ago, and sort of made a new genre. It became so popular, and the new genre was the indie film, which had more of an art house kind of sensibility to it, and in theory came with this mythology of a sort of rugged indie filmmaker who sets out against all odds to make this great picture, and then it becomes a big hit. That's sort of the myth that surrounds some of these things. So she looks at this particular film, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Maybe some of you have seen it. It was quite popular again several decades ago. But she writes the publications, the media that were covering this film, wrote of a low-budget romantic comedy, a movie with neither Hollywood stars nor special effects, that defied the odds to become the highest-grossing independent film of all time. So here, this is clearly a narrative about the film, right, that goes with this indie film story or mythology that we've been telling ourselves, right? That it's a movie without big stars, it doesn't even have special effects, and it's low budget, but yet it becomes this big moneymaker, right? Because of the scrappy filmmaker and so on. Right? But this story that surrounds the film, as she shows us, is not entirely accurate. So what she's interested in doing in this article is dissecting some of the claims that were made around this film. Specifically, she examines the production, distribution, exhibition history of the film to complicate assertions that it could be labeled as the most successful independent film of all time. She challenges the assumption that films like My Big Fat Greek Wedding aren't made anymore by Hollywood. And she problematizes the notion that the marketing for My Big Fat Greek Wedding was some kind of grassroots, bottom-up triumph. And she states her purpose very clearly at the beginning, which is always good in academic writing to tell people what you're trying to do right up front. And she tells us, ultimately, I encourage media analysts to cease from viewing My Big Fat Greek Wedding as an example of one woman and one film defying the odds. Instead, she says, we should consider this film as an example of the uniformity of journalistic discourses, the complexity of the operations of contemporary Hollywood, and the continuing ideological power of the so-called American dream. So she's making some pretty big claims here about the film and about the way the film was represented. So, she says at one point that journalistic discourses are every bit as ideological as the media products generated by the media companies themselves, right? Which is, an interesting statement, right? The idea that journalism, the news, creates stories that are just as ideological as the stories that are generated by Hollywood, for example, right? And if this is true, then I'd normally, if we were face to face in class, I'd ask you, how should we think about our personal engagement with the news media? How should we think about the stories that we're seeing, right? This is particularly true today, right? Even more true than when Perren wrote this particular article. Because we live in a world, as we've seen and as we've discussed, of a very kind of polarized political landscape, where we have a very polarized political landscape, and the media has fed into this, right? The idea of journalistic objectivity has seemingly disappeared today, right? We have news outlets that are very right-wing oriented, like Fox News, for example, and we have news outlets that are very leftist oriented, like MSNBC or CNN, arguably, right? So, what happens then is that these news programs are biased and are intentionally biased in an attempt to appeal to a very specific kind of demographic. But in being biased in order to make money, what's happening is they're generating a product that is inherently ideological, right? That is sending certain messages that are, in essence, designed to favor a certain political viewpoint and favor a particular kind of ruling class in society. It's a kind of war for the ruling ideas, let's say, if we were going to look at this from the Marxist perspective, which we've talked about a little bit in previous lectures. So then how should we look at the news? Can we look at it as if we're being told the story honestly or authentically? And I think the answer is no, right? At least this article would lead us to think about even the news as a kind of fictitious or at least inauthentic or partial kind of presenter of partial narratives, let's say, or even outright misrepresentations at times. And so the message, again, is to sort of take the media messages with a grain of salt, if you will. So she begins talking about her methodology and methodological concerns. And one of the things that I really like about this article, and one of the reasons that I ask you to read it, is because it's a really well put together example of how a tight research paper should look, right? She gives us all the elements that we traditionally want to see in an academic article, and one of those is a discussion of the methodology. So, the question becomes, how can you critique discourses generated by the mainstream press about the entertainment industries, which you rely on heavily? Oh, my Lord. God, I just totally messed up this slide. I'm sorry. When you rely heavily on these same sources to construct an argument. So, she discusses the idea historians have archives, but analysts of contemporary media industries are limited, right? I mean, if you're critiquing, let's say, the Hollywood studios, if you want to go out and look at Warner Brothers and critique it, you don't have the same kind of archives that you could go to like an historian does. And indeed, you have very limited access to the kind of corporate materials that you'd really like to look at. So if you're doing the kind of work in political economy that Schatz does or that Perren does, right, then, I mean, you'd love to get your hands on the corporate memos, on the records of meetings and so on. But of course, you can't get at that, right? And so you have to rely on trade documents, right? Trade publications, movie magazines, mainstream publications, newspapers. And, the only way that you really get any kind of insight into what's happening in the corporation beyond these things is maybe an occasional interview where you can supplement your knowledge and check facts by talking to someone who actually worked in these organizations or with these organizations. So Perren, right up front, is saying, listen, these are some of the problems that confront my method. But she says, this is how I deal with it. And she says, I use a really wide range of sources, which is nice, right? Like it gives us a whole bunch of different points of view. And then she says she situates the articles within the context of research on the structure, conduct, and performance of the entertainment industry. So she really narrows her scope of her research and looks in this one particular, uses this one particular lens to examine this question, right? So to deal with the problems with the methodology, she uses as many sources as she gets her hands on. And then she narrows her scope very, very dramatically, right? Okay. So then, one of the first questions that's begged by this article and these discourses is, what makes an indie film, right? You might know or remember from your 2700 film history course that the evolution of the term independent, in terms of independent films, is a really complex one, right? It begins all the way back in the Thomas Edison Trust era. So anyone making films outside of the Edison Trust was considered an indie filmmaker. And then over the century and a half or so since then, or century and a quarter, the term has developed to mean new things. But today, her argument is we're not really sure sometimes what indie means, right? I mean, we have an idea. There's certainly a kind of aesthetic, and a kind of look that we expect from an indie film. There's certain kinds of content in terms of the narrative and how the story is told and what the story is about that we think of when we think of indie films. But, it's not the case often that there is quote-unquote independent as we like to think that they are, right? So then she wants to debunk what's indie, right? And so she asks the question, what counts as an indie film? Is it about the financing, like how the money is secured, like Spike Lee using Kickstarter to fund one of his films? Is it about the industrial affiliations of the film's distributor? Who's putting the movie out? Is it about where you watch the film? Is it, if you go watch it in an art cinema, is it an indie film? But if you watch it at your local multiplex, is it not an indie film? What about the status of talent in relation to Hollywood, right? Like, I mean, if you see a big star in a movie like Tom Hanks, would you think it's an indie film? Probably not. right? And then, of course, there's this whole idea of the spirit, quote unquote, of the film, or the aura of the film. And that has to do, again, with things like the aesthetics of it, the style of it, how it's shot, what the story's about, right? How the story's told. And so all these things influence, in some way, our idea of what indie films are. And by the way, there's a lot of discussion about this, right? There are numerous books that have been written about what constitutes an indie film. So if this is something that interests you, there's a ton of work on this subject. So from here, she delves into the backstory of the film. And this is where the debunking really sort of begins. She begins with the production. And she says, well, first off, the budget was $5 million. And so this is, kind of average for a low budget film. This isn't somebody making a film on $10,000 that makes millions and millions of dollars. I mean, it costs a fair amount to make, right? And indeed, so 50% of this $5 million comes from Gold Circle Films, Norm Waite, and another 50% from HBO, which is at the time owned by AOL, Time Warner. Now, this independent film, quote unquote, was brought to HBO by Tom Hanks and his wife, Rita Wilson, right? And HBO then secured domestic cable and video rights. So, in essence, what we see is that the majors passed on the project from the outset. So this isn't a major studio film, but it's hard to say that it's, just this scrappy low-budget film because its budget is about average. It's got major players putting up the money for it. It's got really, superstars that are bringing the project to HBO. And HBO is, of course, itself a huge corporate kind of player in the entertainment industry, right? So from there, we see IFC, the Independent Film Channel, picking up the film in what's called a service deal, right? So you got another big Hollywood player picking up the film. And IFC's theatrical film division is a spin-off of the basic cable channel, right, the IFC, Independent Film Channel. And even its name, right, Independent Film Channel, is kind of interesting because IFC was a division of Rainbow Media Holdings, which was a joint venture of Cablevision, General Electric, NBC, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. So, these are massive players in the entertainment industry, some of the biggest players there are, right? So what Perren is doing here is even questioning the whole idea of independent and independent film channel because, these are huge players. So she says it becomes clear that the independent film channel is more of a brand name than a description of its industrial relationships, right? So they're not, this isn't just a scrappy bunch of film students. And so, I think it's kind of fun. There's an episode of 30 Rock that pokes fun at this whole idea where, Alec Baldwin explains the corporate structure of NBC, I believe it is, right? And he goes through this whole thing to show you this corporate map that, GE owns everything, which, GE owns GE Domestic Appliances, which owns Kitchenall, which owns JMI, right, which owns PokerFastlane.com, which is the owner of the Scheinhart Wig Company, which owns NBC. Now, this isn't true, but it's funny because it really does kind of resemble the kind of like wildly arcane and complicated corporate structure that so many of these companies hold, right? And it's what happens, of course, is that once you get far enough removed from GE in this corporate structure, even though you might be a wholly owned subsidiary, it becomes hard for people to recognize that maybe this indie film company is actually owned by a huge conglomerate, right? Okay, so she also talks about the spirit of the film, right? So she says, in terms of style and genre, the film is anything but independent. Indeed, My Big Fat Greek Wedding is interesting in how utterly unoriginal it is. In fact, as many critics noted, it seems more like a 90-minute sitcom than a feature-length film. So what she's doing here is she's saying, listen, it doesn't even really meet the requirements of the spirit of indie films, which, with the idea being that they should be more, let's say, stylistically daring, more unconventional, have more unconventional narratives and so on. She says, listen, this is really kind of a traditional, classical Hollywood kind of enterprise. So then she moves on to the exhibition angle. Where was it? Where was it shown? And she says, listen, it was released as if the film were a commercial film rather than an indie. It had a wide release, right? I'm sorry, it opened in a limited number of theaters, but then quickly went on to wide release. It went for theater chains over art houses, and there was tons of TV advertising, right? Which is something that you don't traditionally see with, a small, low-budget, independent picture. And all this leads to a question that's even more important today than it was when this was written, and that is the question is, where is Hollywood? We talk about Hollywood films, and of course Hollywood is in California. But what Perren is getting at here by asking, where is Hollywood, is she's sort of pointing to the fact that the things that we call Hollywood movies today often aren't made there, right? They're made, a lot of TV shows are made in Canada. A lot of films are made in Canada or in Europe. Of course, Georgia has become a major site for film and television production, right? So she points out that since the studios were increasingly incorporated into large multinational corporations, Hollywood, in quotes, has been more useful as a marketing tool than as an indicator of specific aesthetic characteristics or industrial, economic, and cultural conditions. What used to be autonomous, independently operating motion picture studios don't exist anymore. So, the idea that there was a business whose business it was just to make movies, right? That's gone. Like all of the major studios are owned by huge conglomerates, and they're in a lot of different businesses, right? And usually a lot of different media businesses. So she says, listen, Hollywood is, when we say Hollywood, what we're really talking about is a complex network of media industries in which major entertainment conglomerates exist at the center, and they finance products intended for distribution through a whole bunch of different pipelines around the world. So, we have maybe this idea in our heads of the old Hollywood studio where they just make movies and that's it, but that's not the case anymore. All the studios, again, are owned by huge conglomerates, and they're making these movies, with the idea of, as we talked about in Schatz's blockbuster, right? The movies are only one component. There's all this intertextual storytelling. They're building these worlds and universes, and they're going to distribute all these different media products through all these different pipelines that they're able to control by the fact that there's a huge global conglomerate, right? Like a huge sort of global business behemoth. So then she goes on to tackle the whole idea that Hollywood doesn't make films like this anymore. And she says, listen, according to the discourse, what she reads about this movie, right? The industry, journalists, and scholars have all created a vision of Hollywood as a movie factory that releases films solely for theatrical release. But this isn't true. The reality is that Hollywood makes and distributes films in a variety of other ways. And that indeed the lines that used to exist between film and television, for example, are blurring, right? It used to be that there were distinct ways that we talked about film and TV. Film was the higher art form, right? TV was the idiot box. It was the boob tube. The people who worked in TV weren't as great a bunch of artists as the people who worked in film, right? The filmmaker was an auteur. No one talks about the TV director, and nobody did talk about the TV director as an auteur. Indeed, we don't really talk about that today. We talk about the showrunner today in television, the same way that we talk about the auteur in film. We thought about TV as highly commercial, creatively bankrupt, meaning that it just wasn't good, and we used to think of them in some sense as existing in different universes, as autonomous entities, compartmentalized industry. So on one side there's film, on the other side there's TV. And she says, listen, even decades ago this wasn't the case, right? That there was always a kind of crossover between these two. And so from here, she critiques the whole idea of the film as a kind of Cinderella story. So the film was, of course, conceived by Nia Vardalos, who was described as just a girl from Winnipeg. But she was hardly just a girl from Winnipeg, right? She was in Second City, which was one of the premier comedy troupes in the Midwest, right? She had already had a bunch of film roles and TV roles, and so like it wasn't as if she was nobody, right? And then there was also all this talk about the film being sort of the little film that could, that had this grassroots marketing campaign that made it take off. But in reality, she says the strategy was to make the film look like a major studio release from a major studio. It had saturation advertising, like we talked about with Schatz in the blockbuster era. There were interviews and discussions about the show. Vardalos showed up on Oprah, Regis and Kelly. Right, she was on the cover of Bride magazine. She was all over the place. So there was very definitely, a concerted blockbuster-style media campaign behind the film. So from all this, she comes to the following conclusions. These are the key lessons, right? The label independent needs to be analyzed more closely, right? Because we don't know what we mean when we say that something is an independent film now, right? She says we need to look more closely at the relationships and interdependencies between the studios and the independents and between film and television. We need to understand how software, the content, continues to be vital to the success of the entertainment industry. And then, we have to realize that predicting box office is really difficult, right? We just don't know what's going to do well. We know that the studios have kind of a model, right, where they make these high concept, big budget, special effects driven blockbusters, but they also often try and sort of offset their losses with specialty divisions that focus on low budget, niche oriented films with an edge. And these, a lot of times, are the films that we think are independent films. So in other words, even a lot of the movies that you see that you think, oh, that was a great independent movie, was actually made by one of the major studios through an affiliate, right, or a wholly owned subsidiary that they created just to make indie-looking films on the cheap. And that they do this because every once in a while, one of these films makes a lot of money and it helps offset losses or potential losses from these bigger projects that they engage in. So, of course, the reason that and I want to let you know, it strikes me I probably haven't been talking enough about why I have you read particular things. But the reason that I ask you to read this is, as I already indicated, number one, I think it's a really well put together article. It's a really nice example of how to do an academic article. It's got all the right components in all the right places. Secondly, I think it sheds light on how Hollywood sort of promotes itself and how much of what we take for granted as truth or just the way the industry works is actually just a kind of mythology that the industry creates around itself. And in this, there are some links here, I suggest to you, to people like Adorno and Horkheimer and the culture industry idea, this idea that they're presenting this product and making you think like you have a choice about what you're watching, when in fact it's all coming from the same place and it's all kind of the same product, right? And that's kind of what we see with My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which was supposed to be this upstart indie film, but had HBO behind it, had Tom Hanks behind it, had a pretty good budget, had saturation advertising, had deals worked out from the beginning in terms of distribution and so on, right? I mean, it's coming from the same folks. It's just a slightly different kind of product. So I mean, in some ways, this does bear out the culture industry's argument that Adorno and Horkheimer were making earlier. Okay, well, I hope that you learned something, and thanks for checking out my lecture. See you next time.